During World War II, the British government quietly claimed the wealth of its colonies, locking away over £3 billion from nations like India, Ghana, and Egypt in sterling balances. These blocked reserves fueled London's war effort, but left the colonies impoverished, sparking decades of unrest. How did one secretive financial weapon reshape the fate of entire countries, and whose stories have been left out? Sterling balances were, at their core, a system of financial claims, credits held in London by Britain's colonies, dominions, and wartime allies. These were not piles of gold or vaults of cash, but numbers entered in the ledgers of the Bank of England. Each entry represented money owed by Britain to countries whose goods, resources, and services had been shipped to support the war effort. Yet these credits were not freely accessible. Blocked sterling described their true nature, funds recorded as assets but locked away beyond the reach of the nations that had earned them. By June 1945, at the end of World War II, the total value of overseas sterling balances had reached £3.287 billion. This figure dwarfed the pre-war sums and reflected the scale of the colonial contribution to Britain's survival. India alone accounted for around 1/3 of this total, while Egypt, the Gold Coast, and other territories also held substantial sums. These balances had accumulated through wartime trade surpluses. Colonies exported food, raw materials, and manpower, and Britain paid for these with sterling credits rather than with goods or hard currency. The money was credited to colonial accounts in London, but strict controls prevented it from being converted into dollars or used for local development. The Bank of England tracked these balances with meticulous care. Each colony's claims appeared as lines in official ledgers, with the sums swelling year after year as the war dragged on. For the British government, these blocked reserves became a vital resource. They allowed London to pay for imports, finance military operations, and rebuild after the devastation, all without draining the country's own gold or dollar reserves. But for the colonies, the reality was starkly different. Their export earnings, instead of fueling local growth, were immobilized, sterilized, as officials described it, in the heart of the British financial system. The phrase blocked sterling captured a quiet but powerful truth. Colonial wealth was being held in trust, but with no guarantee of release. The sums involved were not just accounting entries, they represented years of labor, harvests, and sacrifice by millions across the empire. The need for tools to control and manage these balances would soon become a central question, as both Britain and its creditors looked for ways to turn ledger entries into economic power. London's grip on the sterling balances relied on a set of institutional tools designed to keep control over colonial credits, even as the numbers in the ledgers grew. At the heart of this system was the exchange control regime, introduced in 1939 and expanded during the war. Every colony and dominion within the sterling area was required to pool its gold, dollars, and other hard currency reserves in London. The British Treasury, acting through the Bank of England, issued strict instructions. Sterling earned abroad could not be freely converted into dollars or spent outside the sterling area without explicit permission. This meant that even as colonial governments watched their balances swell, they could not deploy those funds for their own priorities, whether to buy American machinery, fund local development, or stabilize their own currencies. The rationale for these controls was laid out in Treasury memos from the early 1940s. Officials argued that the pooling clause, formalized in 1931, was essential for the collective defense of the empire and the survival of sterling itself. The British government insisted that rapid withdrawals or dollar conversions by colonies would threaten not just the pound, but the entire economic recovery of the sterling area after the war. In practice, this meant that the Treasury could dictate the pace at which balances were released, the purposes for which they could be used, and the terms of any conversion. Requests for dollar releases to purchase American goods, for example, were routinely denied or delayed, even when colonies faced urgent needs for reconstruction. Control extended to the management of colonial currency boards and marketing boards. In West Africa and Malaya, export earnings from cocoa, rubber, and other commodities were funneled into sterling securities held in London. The West African Currency Board, for instance, was required to back local currency with more than 100% in sterling assets, effectively locking away the region's export surpluses. British officials justified this by pointing to the need for financial discipline and the prevention of inflation. But the effect was to keep colonial funds circulating within the British financial system. Treasury officials defended these measures as temporary, necessary responses to wartime emergency and post-war austerity. Yet the controls persisted long after the guns fell silent. As colonies pressed for access to their own money, the British government responded with gradual, tightly managed releases, often tied to purchases from Britain or to specific development projects approved in London. The pooling rule and exchange controls became the levers that allowed Britain to finance its own recovery, while colonies waited for permission to unlock the wealth they had already earned. These institutional barriers would become flashpoints for resistance and negotiation as colonial leaders demanded not just political independence, but the right to control their own economic future. In the aftermath of the war, India's position as Britain's largest creditor became impossible to ignore. By 1946, India's sterling balances had climbed to £1.3 billion, more than any other colony or ally. Jawaharlal Nehru, preparing for independence, pressed London for the right to use these funds to buy machinery, rebuild railways, and lay the groundwork for national development. Yet each request ran into a hard ceiling. The British Treasury, worried that a flood of Indian withdrawals would destabilize sterling and drain precious dollar reserves, enforced strict limits on what could be drawn. Only a fraction of the balances could be spent on imports, and almost always on goods sourced from Britain itself. Negotiations stretched through months of tense meetings. Indian officials argued that economic sovereignty meant control over their own reserves. British memos warned that sudden releases would threaten the pound's survival. The impasse forced India to postpone major investments, delaying the ambitions of its first 5-year plan. For Nehru, the locked balances were a daily reminder that political freedom was incomplete without the means to shape the nation's economic future. Cocoa was the Gold Coast's greatest export, yet the wealth it generated rarely reached the people who grew it. Throughout the 1940s, merchant associations and cocoa farmers watched as their export surpluses piled up in London accounts, with more than £200 million held overseas by the time of independence. The colonial government, backed by British policy, used marketing boards to set prices and funnel earnings into sterling balances. Local traders and producers sent letters of protest, published editorials, and organized meetings in CRA, demanding that cocoa revenues be used for roads, schools, and industry at home. Instead, these funds were locked away, their use restricted by rules written in Whitehall. The frustration was not just economic, but deeply political. Kwame Nkrumah, rising as a voice for self-rule, called out the injustice in speeches and pamphlets, insisting that foreign controls over the colony's money kept the Gold Coast dependent and underdeveloped. The blocked balances became a rallying point for a new generation of nationalists, fueling demands for real independence and control over the country's future. Tension between London and Cairo sharpened as Egypt's sterling balances swelled, with £93.7 million sterling recorded in the ledgers by 1952. Egyptian officials, frustrated by years of blocked access to these funds, pressed the British Treasury for immediate releases to support national development. Their demands grew louder after the war, echoing through parliamentary debates and the Cairo press. For Egyptian leaders, these balances were not just numbers on a page, they represented the price of wartime occupation and a claim to economic sovereignty still denied. British diplomats, wary of a sudden run on sterling, insisted on gradual releases, arguing that unrestricted access would threaten the pound's stability and the wider sterling area. The dispute became entangled with negotiations over British military bases and the Suez Canal. Each side saw financial control as leverage. Egyptian finance ministers warned that continued restrictions would undermine cooperation on defense and foreign policy. The standoff over blocked balances fueled nationalist anger, deepening mistrust, and making diplomatic compromise increasingly elusive. Today, the aftermath of blocked sterling balances lingers across former colonies, visible in persistent economic disparity. As debates on reparations and global inequality intensify, the legacies of financial extraction demand reckoning. The shadow of colonial accounting still shapes who prospers and who pays. What would real accountability look like now?